So maybe you clicked on the video after and you said, what are these 5 things and how are they? Are they right? Are they correct about these 5 things? What are these 5 things? These are the 5 essential assumptions of climate that they have within climate change. And these are that primarily that the climate change is an existential threat, right? That it's mostly mankind's fault because of carbon dioxide. That's 3. And that carbon dioxide is a major greenhouse gas, like the one that is the greenhouse gas, the main one, that the knob that changes everything. And then the 5th one, of course, is that you should do something about it, Mr. Poor Person, while the elites run off with all the money and all the subsidies, and they fly their private jets and they burn all the carbon they want, eat all the steak they want. You got to eat the bugs. So these are essentially the 5 essential assumptions about the climate change. And remember, it's capitalized. When it's capitalized, that is because I've got no sepia, but I can get my sepia back. Do you think that this looks better? Or do you think that this looks better? I turned off the color because I just wanted to try black and white. Things are sometimes they're black and white. Sometimes they crash. And sometimes they're not black and white. But in this case, things are a little bit more like shades of gray. They're not exactly black and white, are they, all the time? Mind you, I have to wait for it to load. I have to wait for it to load. Don't mess with OBS settings while you're recording OBS. That's definitely not. Brightness, gamma. If I wanted to change this to, I can't do it that way. Change it to 120 to 118 and then turn color on and then go OK and then get the fuck out of there. Here's the thing. The first assumption is that climate change is an existential threat. That's bogus and insane because we've had human beings on here on the planets for a while, and we've had animals other than human beings, and there was a time supposedly before human beings where there may have been some human beings, who knows, because there might be some evidence that there was some human beings back there, or intelligent beings. And at that time there was an abundance of life. In fact, there was 5 million, I believe it was, times the amount of carbon dioxide in the air, as far as we can tell, and life thrived. However, the whole existential threat argument is based on very flimsy evidence, because we've seen human beings thrive, innovate, and survive countless times. And it's never been greener on planet Earth in like the last 200 some years because there's more plant food. And so that creates this effect. It's not really a greenhouse effect. It's more of a, more plants, more oxygen, more animals, more carbon dioxide, more plant food, which is carbon dioxide, more plants effect. Now, the next thing, of course, is that it's all humanity's fault, but there are many other things that are wrapped into the changing of climates. In fact, there was like 15 different scientific disciplines. You can't be an expert at all of them, so it's a very complicated thing. And so if you look at it, there's this existential threat. It's bullshit. There's just no evidence that it's an existential threat. In fact, the people who chain themselves to cars, climate extinction rebellion, whatever, and then they say just stop oil, that would actually be 1 billion people dead in a year if you just stopped oil. However, there's no evidence to suggest that like a significant amount of evidence that climate change is going to kill us, right? What is climate change? Well, the capital C is essentially a religion. It's a woke extinctionist religion. It's a cult. It's also the $24 or $8 trillion environment fear scam industry. Small c, climate is just weather plus temperature essentially. So any change on either weather, or you have any change of temperature, and you get any it's already changed the climate. It's already changed, son. So it's always changing. And so if we survived through all the other changes, it's logical to say that we'll survive through the next few changes. It's not changing dramatically. The ocean's not rising dramatically. And the Younger Dryas period supposedly it rose even faster than it is now. And some people think there was a great deluge, a great flood there. And then there's the other thing, deluge, whatever. And that is they think it's that it's mostly human beings' fault, right? But there's a lot of other things that factor into it. It's just bogus that it's all humanity's fault. In fact, they haven't tracked it from before the Industrial Revolution, so they wouldn't know what it was like before human beings were producing more carbon emissions. Mind you, it does seem like it might have been less green back then, because that makes sense too. Put it to logic, the science that you learn in high school doesn't suddenly become obsolete because climate change, existential threat. Every 10 years, we gotta give us money. You go on the pod, eat the bugs, you will die, innovate to zero, and your carbon must be attributed to zero, right? But ultimately, what they talk about these elites, they drop the carbon to oxygen, they drop the oxygen, and they just talk about carbon because at the end of the day, there's this equation, P times E times S times F or something like that equals climate change, carbon emissions, right? So P, let's start with that, they say. P represents people. You got to get one of these numbers down to zero. They say this. And so it's about eliminating carbon. It's about demonizing carbon. There's 5 or so elements to life on Earth, and that is carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, sunlight, and the magic that is I am, like you put those five elements together, and what you end up having is water and carbon and oxygen, to make different combinations to create water, to make carbon to oxygen, to create the things, photosynthesis, sun and stuff, and energy, and that stuff. Those 4 or 5 fundamental elements of life on Earth, you demonize one, you're damned. One is definitely, I'm trying to cover the light bulb. One is basically, remove one, and that's it. You need all of them, and they go up together more or less. But the whole idea that it's only mankind is bullshit. The whole idea that carbon dioxide is the only greenhouse gas or the main greenhouse gas, when the evidence is that it may not even be a greenhouse gas at all. It's in fact, the greenhouse effect is mostly good. If you look at Mars, how it was, maybe 100 million years ago, and then you look at Mars now. Okay, what changed? Well, you had Mars supposedly with life and an atmosphere. Now Mars doesn't. Do the math. Atmospheres are always being lost, possibly, potentially, maybe even every planet's have the atmospheres go away. And so, like, what's going to stop that? Well, it turns out actual greenhouse gases, like maybe water vapor, methane, actual greenhouse gases create a greenhouse effect, trap the atmosphere, and keep it from leaching, going out into space, and basically that's good. Now, if you have too much warming, you might have bigger animals, like it was supposedly a long time ago. Big animals build plants, big creatures, maybe big giant humans too, who knows, or something before humans or whatever, something different. But it doesn't eliminate life. And if you can adapt to that, you'll be good. But that was like 5 million times as much carbon and oxygen as we had, and everything else. And the carbon oxygen basically goes up in proportion, not necessarily because of other things. It might be correlation, it might be causation. It's probably some sort of causation, but that doesn't mean that carbon and oxygen itself causes the greenhouse effects. It might just be an effect caused by the greenhouse effects of water vapor and methane and actual greenhouse gases. So it's actually good. But since they implemented more of these green supposed technologies in Europe, the bullshit, the solar and the wind and stuff, that maybe water, they've actually produced more greenhouse emission, more carbon emissions, because you have to build those windmills, and the solar plants only last for 10 years, cheap crap from China, whatever. It's like, so it basically boils down to that. The third, fourth thing, right, is that it's existential threat, busted. It's all humanity's fault, mostly busted. It's just carbon to oxygen, busted. And then the idea that greenhouse gases are bad, right? There's not a double side to that. Now, on the other side, to look at it, and then maybe they can actually be good. Well, there's actually a good thing about greenhouse gases. So demonize greenhouse gases, not carbon dioxide, but actual greenhouse gases, might not be a good idea. And so then the fifth thing is, well, you should do something about it. But the poor people, people like you and me, we don't have actually the most capital that we push around to change climate. And the whole idea that any one person or any 8 billion people could like seriously alter the climate of this planet, well, you would have to perhaps understand. I think you need to really look to understand reality before you try to change it. And this is one of those things where you just try to project your own reality, your postmodern nonsense in your brain onto reality to try to manifest reality when you don't even understand how reality works. And I would say that I don't understand how climate works enough to try to start changing it. I can clearly see from space that there is no collective of scientists to know either. Okay, we would need everyone working together to actually understand how it works, because we have like 15 different disciplines you have to be an expert in simultaneously, and the experts are not decided on anything. They always bring up this data, this statistics. They say that 95% of scientists or something agree that climate change is mostly man's fault or something like that. But it's actually turns out it's 95% of these scientists specifically think that climate change happens. And so that could be talking about climate change as in the climate changing, not capital C, but the little. And it turns out that even that was like a 75% of 75% of 95%, or 40% or 50%. It turns out that it's even a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of scientists who even believe that in this one fucking university that small c climate change happens. But that's kind of obvious, right? Because you go outside and the weather's different than it was yesterday. So it's like, okay, small climate is always changing. It's kind of like a self-evident thing, right? But where are we headed? Are we going to be very different in the future? Is it going to be very similar or very different in the future? Can we predict these things? Are there cycles of ice and stuff that we could maybe figure out? And it's just one of those things where the people who are actual scientists are not decided. They're still they're scratching their head. They're still doing the work. But the politicians and the scam artists, oh boy, you know, I like his personality, but like Elon Musk made like half his wealth by the subsidies and stuff off of, in 2020, the largest transfer of wealth from the poor people to the rich people and the middle class, maybe middle people. But like, it's a scam. There's so many of these scams. You got to be smarter than a scam. And I'll leave you with this one thing. The beginning of this whole climate change alarmism, which the opposite of that is climate realism. Scientists are doing that too. I mean, there was a study, one more study about ocean acidification, and one group of scientists, to prove that ocean acidification was real, basically they took ammonia and put it in the water to speed up the process so they wouldn't have to wait so long instead of carbon dioxide. But ammonia or some sort of acid like that, right? But carbon dioxide, is it really an acid? It might be corrosive. It might be corrosive, but it's not necessarily an acid. And using something else entirely different, it's not really science, right? Turns out when you actually use carbon dioxide, a climate realist, and if you want to call them right-wing scientists, whatever, put in the actual carbon dioxide in the water, and you got a completely different outcome. And then when they actually use carbon dioxide to acidify the ocean, they got the biggest giga shrimp, the giga crabs, the giga fish, the giga fucking all the animals were giga and big and red and virile and survived. They flourished, they thrived, they got good. And ultimately, I think I'll leave it this one thing: the beginning of the climate change narrative, the global warming, the 28 trillion dollar fear scam industry basically began with two studies, ice and wood. And the first study was ice or wood, and they glued them together. And it turned out when you glue these two studies together, there's a spike in the middle. Two completely different studies. That's not science. And so, in conclusion, I consider the whole 5 assumptions narrative to be busted. If you agree or disagree, tell me in the comment. Put a comment and go watch that video or that content drop right there. I wish I could rotate, flip around this thing, but I can't. E plus, be human. It's exohumanism, baby.